documentary. Well, I put that one on there. That's nice.
Right, are we sitting comfortably? Shall we? Right, now we've just left the very first burials in the graveyard. If you remember, before that, we had the first page of the burial records, and just before we move much further, these were the bits in between those last two pages. There was Isabella, the grandmother, the twins at the top. These are the bits in between. And the reason I just want to point this out is because there's interesting things like the vicar until here, this is, you see at the top, it's 1844, so the twins were in 1843. We've got Roland Ingram, who was actually the vicar of Giggleswick, of course. And we haven't got an incumbent here in Rathmell until July the 14th, the next burial, in 1844, which is quite a long time. He'd actually been a curate at Giggleswick before he was here, but he doesn't last long. He's going to disappear by the end of this page to other pastures new. Just a couple of the people on here. Just like to point out, we've got Jane Green here, who's just 23. Now, Jane Green was the daughter of a chap called Francis Green. Is one of you Francis Green? Francis Green. Or maybe. No, anyone Francis Green? Okay, it was a long time ago, you might have forgotten. No? Okay, well, Francis Green was a shoemaker. Remember that name, Francis Green. And also down here, we've got Christopher Green, October the 25th. This was her grandfather's brother, so a great uncle. He's related. Alice Lister was a pauper who'd spent her life in Bentham and was here just for her last few years, 75. And at the top we've got Elizabeth Williamson, who, when she was widowed, she used to live in Long Preston with her children. She moved over to Rathmell with her sons because they had started farming. So that's just some of the people in between. Now then, where have we got to? One grave you can't help but notice, I'm sure you will have seen this one, is the Haythornthwaite gravestone. And in the burial records, we've got this appalling record here. Record number 126, 127, 128. And when Brian was showing me the record, it stuck out a mile, partially because of the name Haythornthwaite, which is such a fantastic name. But also, June 1885. Look, on the 13th, we've got Mabel May, who is 18 days. Then we've got Ada Mary, who was 1 year, 11 months. And then in July, John Robert, who was 9. On the next page of the records, we've got Richard Thomas, who was 3 days, just 2 years later. How tragic is that? George Holden underneath, you will recognise that name. He's the son of Thomas and Mary Holden, we talked about before. These 4 children were all 4 children of the same family. They all belonged to Richard Haythornthwaite, I've lost my page, and Margaret Hitchin. They had 7 children. These 4 have died. They had 3 daughters left. Now, Richard Haythornthwaite, that's the grave of the 3 children. He lived here, which some of you may know, Quarry House, and he ran it as a grocer's shop as well as farming. This is in the 1880s, I think, 1885, obviously. So that was there. This just tells us he was elected a churchwarden at Giggleswick Church, where they had wardens for each of the sub-churches in the parish. So, anyway, he was in Rathmell for most of his life. This came up for Richard Haythornthwaite. A police case, petty sessions, blah, blah, blah. Stephen Lancaster, a blacksmith residing in Rathmell, was charged with being drunk in the village of Rathmell. This is about as naughty as you get in Rathmell. On the 14th, Constables Norton and Spenceley, having proved the charge, Mr. R. Haythornthwaite, that's our Richard, who had come at defendant's request, pleaded guilty on his behalf, and a fine of 15 shillings, including cost, was inflicted. I have to say, I've looked at many of these articles, 15 shillings is rather excessive. The majority of ones I found get charged 5 shillings, that's the standard amount, but for some reason, he must have been very drunk. He got charged 15 shillings. He actually lived a few doors down from Richard, and he actually came from Settle. The rest of his family, the Lancaster family, were in Settle. And I always think, well, why has he moved from Settle to Rathmell? Not that you wouldn't want to come and live in Rathmell, obviously I'm thinking about it myself, but you know, why did he come to Settle? Well, there's one thing that might be a clue, or might not. When a child is born, an illegitimate child, to a woman, well, obviously to a woman. It's been a long evening.
These days, you're not so sure.
Especially if it was a boy, they are sometimes named after the father. So, for example, if a woman gave birth to a child called Stephen Lancaster Smith, it's possible the father was Stephen Lancaster. Well, that didn't happen, but a girl was born called Annie Lancaster Close, or something. And so there was only one family of Lancasters in Settle, and the child was born in Settle. And if you look at the brothers in that family, the other brothers all stayed in Settle. It was in 1879, this was in the early 1880s. So one theory could be, and if you are related to Stephen Lancaster, I'm not in any way saying this is the gospel truth, but it's possible that he decided to leave Settle for diplomatic reasons and came and set up in Rathmell. He remained unmarried and stayed in Rathmell for the rest of his life and actually died in the workhouse. But it's just, you always notice these things. I wonder, why did he move from Settle? It could have been something else completely. He could have just fancied someone in the village or whatever. Anyway, Richard Haythornthwaite is bailing him out there and coming to his hearing for him, which is rather nice of me, isn't it? Right, okay. Now, Richard's father, John, had also lived in Rathmell, and he also had a third cousin who lived at the old Cockley Bank earlier on in time. Anyway, side issue. Also, there were various extended families of the Haythornthwaites who all also lived in the graveyard. I'm not going to tell you about them because they were farmers and they married a farmer's daughter and the children were farmers. And then I noticed this on the burial records. I just happened to notice between 1851 and 1853, these people were buried. Now these Williamsons, they are the children of that Williamson that was on the first page of the burial records, the widow who'd come over with her sons. These were two of her grandchildren. And also, look who we've got here, Francis Green. What did we say he was? He was the shoemaker who was the father of Jane Green, who died on the first page. They're all there. But look, you probably can't read, so I won't try and make it. The name of the incumbent here is Richard, or R.D. Haythornthwaite. He hasn't got an A, but it's Haythornthwaite. And this was between, where is no page, December 1851 and July 1853. Now, it just so turns out that our Richard, the previous one, whose 4 children died, his grandfather was Richard Haythornthwaite, and if this was the chap, he was aged between 85 and 87 when he was here at the church, and he died the following October. But it could be him. There are no other Richard Haythornthwaites in the vicinity. So I'm putting my money on him. So there's quite a few Haythornthwaites. One other name I'd just like to point out to you, Francis Green, the shoemaker, was buried by Edward Mayle. Who is Edward Mayle? Edward Mayle, is one of you Edward Mayle?
Me. I? Yes, me.
You've got Edward Mayle. Well, you can sit there and reflect on yourself for a few moments.
I do that regularly.
Just talking of vicars and burials, this came off your wonderful village website. I'm sure a lot of you know him. This chap in the middle is the Reverend Abel Chapman. And he was here from 1860 to 1866. And he came from London. He previously served in Wiltshire. His wife had been Anne Hubbersty. And his wife died when they were in Wiltshire, and he moved up here with this entourage. Now, this entourage is his sister-in-law and several young ladies who were at his previous parish. And in the which one are you? You are Abel. And in the census, you may not be able to see, we've got Abel Chapman, who is 77, with Sarah Hubbersty, that's his sister-in-law, who's 63. Then we've got Elizabeth, Eliza, who are young ladies, and their brother, who is 17, and servants. Now, it was not legal for you to marry your sister-in-law until 1904 if your wife had died. And I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate was going on, but I would just like to say, he liked to surround himself with a female of the species, didn't he? So that picture you've got of him, that is actually Abel. He actually died in Cheshire soon after he finished here, and this whopper of a tomb is the sister-in-law, Sarah Hubbersty, and one of these young ladies. So, and they've got a whopper tomb there. So just an interesting picture. And no, it is actually a nice picture of Rathmell, but you just have to think, what's going on there? What's going on there? Anyway, as was the case with so many clergy in those days, when he died, he left a whopping well over the equivalent of £1 million as well. But the clergy were part of the aristocracy in those days, weren't they? Now, we haven't really had any scandal and gossip in Rathmell, and there isn't that much to be found, but I did find this. Poor old Joseph Fishwick. Now, Isabella Tower up here, buried by Edward Mayle, that we've heard of before. Who was Edward Mayle? Just remind me. Who was Edward? Right, yep. So you've buried Isabella Tower. Isabella Tower was Joseph Fishwick's mother-in-law. And she died, aged 83, another long-lasting one, in September the 7th, 1854. Okay, so September 1854. 6 months later, in March 1855, Joseph Fishwick died. Now, he'd had a long illness, he'd become deaf, and he eventually died. His wife was still alive and several of his children. And so the family obviously wanted him buried with Isabella. The Reverend Edward Mayle had other ideas, and this is one. Just a wonderful article. Clerical bigotry. I mean, that's a good time to start off with, isn't it? Right, if you're sitting comfortably, you've just got to hear this. During the last few years, perhaps more than at any previous period of the present century, the clergymen of the Church of England have been divided in their feelings and bearing towards their fellow Christians, while one portion have been gradually growing in usefulness and liberality towards non-conformists, and increasingly desirous to spread the evangelical truth, another portion have gone in an opposite direction and exhibited an amount of bigotry and intolerance almost unequalled since the days of Laud. Of one of this latter class it is now our task to speak. Joseph Fishwick, our Joseph, rented a small farm called Scalper End. You know where, yes? Where is it? In the township of Rathmell and parish of Giggleswick in the diocese of Ripon. Last week, after an illness of some duration, Mr. Fishwick died, and his friends proposed to inter his remains in the graveyard of Rathmell Church, the church of the township in which he had lived. The incumbent of that place of worship, however, the Reverend Edward Mayle, is a gentleman who appears to hold notion of his own upon the matter of the Church of England's burial service. And because the deceased had not been a communicant at Rathmell Church, this priest peremptorily refused to read the burial service over the body. So because he'd been going to an independent church, he was refusing to bury him in Rathmell graveyard. Can you imagine his poor distraught family? It is pleasing to, this is a bit later, it is pleasing to know, however, that the feelings exhibited by him found no response in the bosom of the vicar of Giggleswick, who at once acceded to the request that the body might be interred there, and who himself read the burial service. It is right to say that the relatives of the deceased were put to much inconvenience and trouble by the bigotry of the incumbent of Rathmell, as the parish church of Giggleswick is fully 3 miles further from the residence of the deceased than the church of Rathmell. Conduct such of that as the Reverend Edward Mayle furnishes its own comment. We therefore merely add to the foregoing facts that the circumstances will be brought under the notice of the Bishop of Ripon. So, if you look in the burial records of Giggleswick Church, sure enough, Joseph is there. So he wasn't going to change his mind. Now, it's quite interesting because there were no more burials by Edward Mayle. And in fact, 6 months later, the next vicar had handed in his notice where he was, and the people in his parish were buying him presents saying good luck in Giggleswick. Now, we know how long it takes to get a vicar in place, don't we, Jim? It could take a long time. So I am thinking that he didn't do much more here after this. It was not popular. And in fact, This is his obituary when he died sometime later. There has just died at Oxford, he went to Oxford, the Reverend Edward Mail, a clergyman of singular ability, says the Daily News. But withal, so that his friends could never understand how he could write, much less preach, his famous sermon. The Mystery of Clothing, which caused at the time considerable sensation. I think I've missed out a line there, have I? Oh, withal so shy, he was so shy. He preferred not to take parish work, but to help his friends, and at Oxford he was best engaged in literary work, confining himself chiefly to translations from Latin to French authors. He has devoted his considerable private means to helping friends, many of whom he has saved from ruin, but was too regardless of his own comfort. So he's never worked as the vicar of the church again after that. I'm sure Mrs. Fishwick would be quite pleased about that. However, before he left completely, he did marry Elizabeth Geldard. And here is their wedding certificate, which probably isn't very clear. Edward Mail, Elizabeth Geldard. This is April the 23rd the following year, and the new incumbent is in place, M.F. Smythe. So that's that, April the 23rd the following year. So he hung around long enough to find himself a wife, and then they moved down to Oxford. Just out of interest, the previous wedding was that of Anthony Beverley and Bridget Holden. They were just the wedding before. They were the family that we talked about before they set up the brewery. So it all links together. Now, the new vicar was Matthew Ford Smythe, who has the most impressive grave in your graveyard. And we haven't time, but in the top, basically his previous parish is saying how wonderful you've been, here's a collection. And this second one is about the joyous season of the year, and basically Matthew Ford Smythe, as soon as he's arrived, is holding basically a big garden party to bring everybody together, obviously sensing the mood in the village after previous Edward Mail. And basically viewing the object of the meeting, the reciprocal feeling of friendship and gratitude which pervaded the whole, it evidently seems to foreshadow good times coming. So a very promising start for this man. Although unfortunately, he was to die just a year later. He was only 35. He was Irish, he'd been married, his wife went off and his widow married somebody else, but it's a shame he wasn't here longer. But that was him, and that's one of the most fantastic gravestones in the yard. Now, obviously, nonconformism is massive in Rathmell through history, and I'm sure a lot of you know that. It's the oldest church in the Settle circuit, set up 1763, 6 years before Settle. And initially they met in farmhouses. Mrs. John Tomlinson was credited with being the first female preacher on the circuit. Chapel was built in 1845. The money raised by subscription opened in 1846 by Gervase Smith and renovated in 1893. So Methodism going good and strong, and obviously the plaques on the side of College hold obviously testament to that. So very strong. So why Edward Mail came into that environment in the first place, I do not know, but there you go. What about the rest of Joseph's family? Well, we know his mother-in-law is already buried in the graveyard. His wife also got buried in the graveyard, and his son also got buried in the graveyard, and also an illegitimate grandson also got buried in the graveyard. So the rest of the family obviously were allowed to be buried there, but what a shame that happened in the first place. They had a daughter called Mary Ann Fishwick, who married a farmer, Benjamin Ayton, and two of their sons, they lived in Tosside, but two of their sons are actually buried in the graveyard, and it would be nice to think the rest of those Fishwicks are all buried together there as well. Benjamin and Mary Ann joined them later on. So, if we want any more scandal there, we have to go a little bit further afield, so we're just going to spread our wings a tiny bit. We're going to go down to Wigglesworth, which I'm sure a lot of you know very well. We're going to Cowbridge. I'm sure you know Cowbridge, down in Wigglesworth. And that is because in Wigglesworth, we have Jane and Betsy Dickinson. Do we have Jane and Betsy Dickinson? Any of you James and Betsy, or are you Jane?
Bingo.
Bingo, there we go. A couple of sisters, Jane and Betsy Dickinson. Now, Jane and Betsy Dickinson, they were children of John and Sarah, who lived to a ripe old age, lived and worked there their whole lives, most of the 19th century. And these two sisters were to marry two brothers. And the two brothers were called Thomas and Henry Wincup. Do we have Thomas Wincup in our midst?
Yeah.
Thomas Wincup. What does he look like he's doing in that picture?
Policeman.
He looks like he's a policeman, yes. It was Jane who married Thomas Wincup. Unfortunately, the other sister, Betsy, married Thomas's brother, Richard, and died shortly afterwards, presumably in childbirth. The other brother was a quarry manager. Thomas was the first detective to be appointed after the West Riding Constabulary was established in 1856. And when that happens, the police records online are fantastic. So we know that Thomas Wincup was 25 and a half. He wasn't actually, he lied. He wasn't old enough for that. But he was 5'8¼ inches. He was fair, he had blue eyes, light brown hair, all these sorts of things. He was working as a wheelwright. He was single when he signed up. But you get loads of police records, which is great. You also find out if they've been dismissed for being a naughty boy. But he wasn't. He was regularly promoted. And he was in Settle until May 1871. And then he moved to Bolton by Bowland. And he ended up being a superintendent in Pontefract. Very, very successful. So he's married Jane Dickinson from here. They had 3 children, one of whom died in childbirth and is buried at Settle. And he did lots of petty crime. So it was burglary, it was dealing with vagrants, it was the laws about lodging houses, like we discovered PC Cockshop before, the laws at the inns, traffic offences, making sure shops were selling the right weights and measures and not trying to defraud people, and also dealing with things like the cattle plague of the 1860s. But this, for me, sums up police work of the 19th century. This is PC Wincup when he was living in Settle. He lived in Chapel Street. But in 1865, there was a suspected burglar at the post office. So what did they decide to do? It was suspected that the person committing the theft had gained access to the post office through the shop of Mrs. Wildman, who was actually the postmaster's wife, which joins it. And calculating upon the possibility of something of the kind being attempted again, it was arranged that PC Wincup, or Thomas, should conceal himself in the shop early in the morning, Monday morning, ready to pounce upon his customer if such an opportunity presented itself. PC Wincup accordingly secreted himself in a cupboard in the shop and had not been long in ambush before the prisoner, who is Miss Wildman's charwoman, made her appearance. And she was arrested and all of that sort of stuff. But can you imagine? Oh, I'll go and hide in a cupboard. So that's our PC Wincup. Now, he had a very, very successful career. And because of the time, I won't read you all of this. But basically, he was very successful. He won awards from royalty for rescuing a woman off a railway line. He diffused many of the riots at the coal mines and did really, really well. He was the oldest serving policeman when he retired eventually. Now then, Mrs. Wildman, who's in the post office, I just went exploring and found this. Appointment of postmaster, Mrs. Wildman. This is 6 months after this happened, so she probably was quite upset. Having resigned the office of postmistress at Settle, Mr. John Battersby of the same town has been appointed postmaster in her stead. Mr. John Battersby. Where have we heard the name Battersby before?
Barnabas.
Barnabas Battersby. And were you our John Battersby?
Yes.
What does he look like he's doing? He looks like he's a post. Yeah. So he is replacing her. Now it turns out that John Battersby was actually the son of Barnabas. In the 1841 census, there's Barnabas as a farmer. His first wife had died, and he's living with 3 children and a female servant, and they're living just outside Long Preston. So Barnabas was married before, and John was the one that took over the post office. His 3 children didn't marry. Unfortunately, Henry ended up in an asylum. John ran the post office with his sister Mary, and they both stayed there about another 10 years before they died. They had a very comfortable life because when Barnabas died, another massively rich family as well, Barnabas died leaving, where are we, how many millions did he leave? I've just written in my notes, Barnabas died in 1861 leaving millions. So it was a lot. Anyway, so it all ties up, it's all quite a small world. Anyway, just let's have a quick flick through as we're on to I just thought that was quite nice, hiding in the cupboard. Then we've also got Superintendent Thomas Blanchard, who's not related to Brian. And this is his memorial stone, and it says, this is in Settle graveyard, in memoriam, Thomas Blanchard, Superintendent of Police, Settle, died November the 11th, 1898, aged 41 years. In the midst of life we are in death, which is often what's inscriptions if people die earlier than it would seem natural. This stone was erected by the fellow superintendents of the West Riding Constabulary. Well, isn't that nice? So that's good. Now, we spent a lot of time in the first half talking about the really successful families living at Millgate House and Butterfield House, but not everybody was quite like that, were they? This Thomas Blanchard was a policeman, and he's going to discover a few things that weren't quite as good as that. His father was another one of these fathers that went off to America soon after he was born, and he was brought up by his grandparents, and he'd worked for a lot of time, Knaresborough, Rotherham and Bingley. He'd married, he'd had a couple of kids. He only came to settle in 1895, and we can see he's going to die in 1898, so he hasn't got long in settle. Just one thing that was quite interesting, in the 1891 census, before he came here, you may notice the last person on this census, there's Thomas with his wife and a couple of kids. Then we've got this chap here, William Hardy. Can you see what that says? No. He's a prisoner. He's a prisoner. So on the night of the census, he's living with Thomas. Now, it wasn't actually that uncommon in those days for prisoners to spend the night with policemen, because they often had little cells attached to their house. But anyway, here he is. And when I looked up what he was in for, rather disturbingly, he was arrested for carnally knowing a girl between 13 and 16 years. Which is slightly concerning when you see that Thomas has got a daughter who's aged 9. It's not as bad as it maybe seems. Well, I mean, it is in today's values, but in those days you could marry when the girl was 14. But, you know, it still seems a bit dodgy to me. Anyway, that was in 1891. He's come to settle in 1895. And then, in 1898, before he's going to die, he probably had one of the most interesting cases that happens around these parts where you are all very well-behaved people. Because this happened. We're going to go to the plough-in. I'm sure we've all been there, haven't we? Now, next time you go there, you might have a slightly different feeling about the place. This is 1898. Because this came in the newspapers. Alleged murder near Settle. And I'll need to read you this. At Settle Police Court yesterday before Hector Christie, blah, 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 Annie Tarn, aged 25, daughter of Mr. Joseph Tarn of West Horton, that's meant to say, Horton West even, was charged on remand with the wilful murder of her illegitimate son, Ralph Tarn. Is one of you Annie Tarn? Yes, yes, we have on it. She looks like, what does she look like?
A hard-faced milkmaid.
Hard-faced milkmaid. Annie had actually been working as a servant at the Plough-in. So she's up for the murder of her illegitimate son, Ralph Tarn, of which Robert Taylor is alleged to be the father. James Williams got 26 farm labour, who's related to Annie, and Robert Taylor of the Plough-in Wigglesworth, innkeeper, farmer and blacksmith, were charged with being accessories. So Robert Taylor is alleged to be the father. He's the landlord of the inn. He's married and he's got 5 kids, obviously, but he's accused with this murder. Mr. Brayshaw stated Tarn gave birth to a child on December the 21st, and Mrs. Emmett also had a child about the same time. The latter's child died about December the 30th. However, she then nursed Tarn's baby. So 2 women had a baby, the other woman's baby died, and this other woman has agreed to nurse, breastfeed Annie's illegitimate child. In March, Annie Tarn and the child left. She took the baby away and arrived at Settle. The child was not seen again. On Friday last, Annie wrote a letter to Mrs. Emmett, and in consequence of admissions prisoners were arrested. Superintendent Blanchard, our Superintendent Blanchard, evidence was to the effect that when he arrested the prisoner at her father's house, she said, "Well, I've nought to say, you know all the facts, you will find the body somewhere about the Plough Inn, if Taylor has not destroyed it." So who knows what happened? All I can tell you is there are no more records for little Ralph at all.